This is about the Hays Code, this video. So I'll be talking about the history behind it and how it impacted today's film industry in both the UK and the US, and the censorship that is restrictive in terms of storytelling, audience reception, and regularity frameworks. So I'm just giving you historical context and tell you the legacy of the Hays Code and how it came to be to when the film classification system arrived. So I'll be starting with understanding the Hays Code. So this is the historical overview. So it established in 1930 because of certain events, things that happened in the industry that they want to control, like people's lives. In terms of the actors, they controlled their lives, and it ruined a lot of people's reputations and careers as well. And the studio system was in for this Hays Code because it's by a man called Will Hays, because he's the person behind the Hays Code, and it's both the Hays Code was both implemented in both industries in the UK and the US. Like, there were certain things that that are morally not appropriate, basically. So they have to put the Hays Code on top of it. So, and some films have been banned in countries like Ireland, because Ireland's a Catholic country, for example. And a man called Joseph Breen had influence as well, which he may come up in this presentation too. So let's get to it. In terms of the timeline of how the Hays Code was implemented. So this is the evolution of film censorship in the US. So the first law was made in 1897, beg your pardon. So 100 years before my life. So Maine was the first banned prize fighting films. So films that have boxing and violence in them, fighting scenes in them. So I guess that's when it became a thing. So in 1915 there was a hearing, a Supreme Court ruling about films being it's like a commercial thing, and there was implications of the pre-code era. So kind of before the Hays Code there was some sort of classification in terms of banning what's deemed morally acceptable and not acceptable for people to watch. And the Hays Code has been introduced in 1930. They were monitoring certain things. There's one example called, I'll get into it later, but about this comedy actor. He allegedly killed someone, and some people thought he's guilty, some people didn't. The court ruled in his favour that he got acquitted, basically, and the Hays Code was kind of born from that, in a sense. So, and a lot of films had to follow this guideline, because a lot of films were deemed inappropriate or not morally acceptable, like marrying someone or being in a relationship with someone that is not a spouse, or smoking, violence, it's alcohol drinking and all those things. And a lot of film noir films struggled with that, and a lot of romantic dramas and all those other ones. So we have it ended in 1966 when the new rating system in the US called the M was introduced by the MPAA, which is basically the end of the Hays Code. So the understanding of the UK film classification system by the BBFC, which is the British Board of Film Classification. So they're responsible for overseeing the classification of films in the UK, determining suitability for various ages in terms of which films audiences can watch based on the classification. The film ratings include PG, Universal, 12A. So I'll get into that in more detail. Guidelines that are frequently revised to reflect evolving societal norms and values, so ensuring that the classifications remain relevant and accurate in terms of what audiences, in terms of the age brackets, can watch, basically. So it does protect children from inappropriate content, and it does that, but it informs parents what content, what films are appropriate for their children to watch. It's like this in video games and TV shows as well, or series. So what is more appropriate for your children? If you're a parent and you're watching this, you would understand where you will get an idea of where this classification system came from. So you know what to implement or what content your children should be watching based on that. But I'll get into that in more detail. So the process involves public consultation, meaning there's research involved and you have to align with the public sentiment of and expectations. It's all about society itself, really. So the next slide, I'll be talking about the age classification from Universal, which is basically the umbrella term for everyone, allowing to see the content suitable for everybody. Parental guidance is advised, meaning that some scenes may be unsuitable for young children. So you basically need to be present when those scenes occur. So the parental guidance, you have to be with your kids when you're watching the film with them. It's for the best. So 12A or 12 is both the same thing. The children under 12 have to be accompanied by an adult when they watch these films that are that age bracket. 15 is suitable for 15 years and over. And 18 is basically an adult who's 18 plus. So in this country, we always class an adult as an 8. It's 18 is the minimum age you can be considered an adult in this country. Next slide. Okay, what happened? Oh, yes. So the influence of the Hays Code in terms of film production. So the enforcement of moral standards. So the Hays Code impose strict moral guidelines that filmmakers have to adhere to. So it does limit the portrayal of certain themes and behaviours in films during its enforcement. It restricted the filmmakers' creativity as well. So that was the one problem with the Hays Code. And the type of stories that people want to tell. You can't tell deeply personal stories. You can only go by those certain stories that are more suited. So the rise of the pre-code era, which is before the Hays Code actually, it took full effect. So it was characterized by films that often challenge societal norms and push boundaries in terms of storytelling and character development. But some filmmakers had tried to do the same when the Hays Code came about, but the Hays Code was already there to restrict that. And a lot of filmmakers like Otto Preminger and Billy Wilder both defied the restrictions of the Hays Code because they started making films that were personal for them, really, and more mature, that explored more mature and complex themes in the subject matter they wanted to cover. So it's signalling the shift in cinematic storytelling. Even the studio system, they really liked the sound of it. Even though I think the Catholics didn't like the Jews. It's kind of like this hatred towards Jews sort of thing. Because we know that the film, as you already know, the film industry was mostly, the studio system was mostly run by Jews, per se, in terms of the studio executive producers, that sort of thing. Yeah. So, paving the way for change. So, the Hays Code contributed to the relaxation of censorship standards. So, they allowed the freedom and greater artistic expression in cinema. So, it's just kind of faded, basically, in the sense that the Hays Code was not. The Hays Code had kind of dwindled in a sense during the end of the latter years and stuff, because filmmakers are starting to become freer and there's no studio system anymore, which collapsed in 1948. But I think the real year was around in the 1960s. I can't remember the exact year. So, yeah, basically. So it allowed creative freedom in cinema and all those things. So, these are the case studies of films that defied the Hays Code. The Outlaw faced significant scrutiny in terms of suggestive marketing and depictions of sexuality, promoting debates about the limits of the production code. So the production code didn't really do a lot, basically, in a sense. It did and it didn't. Because if you're going to make a film noir during that time, you do have to kill off the so-called bad guys, like the femme fatale and the person that killed whoever. So the murderer had to be killed as well. That sort of thing. But that film was a bit suggestive. The woman was very wearing revealing clothing, for example. So there's Psycho, which is a very well-known film, Alfred Hitchcock's film. So it depicted graphic depictions of violence and sexuality. But it led to the re-evaluation of their production's code in relevance to modern cinema. So he had to go through all of that just for that film to be made and all those things. In censorship challenges, so those notable films not only challenged the Hays Code, but sparked conversations about the nature of censorship and audience expectations. So that was that, basically, like, in terms of how some films are going against the grain, basically. It's like challenging the code itself. So you challenge the way it's been implemented, if it's really a good idea. I think nowadays the age classification system would be better off in terms of what the content, what it contains, can be implemented in the classification system. And how the cultural impact as well, not just in terms of the industry impact. So it reflected the cultural attitudes towards sex and violence, influencing how future films approached these sensitive topics. Although I do feel like sometimes people felt like they didn't feel protected on set because we have the Me Too movement now, and it's been used less than before. And there's a lot of the industry has come a long way, but it still has a lot of work to do. So, and the decline of the Hays Code. So those controversies surrounding these films did contribute to the decline of the Hays Code. So it allowed for more artistic freedom in the film industry. So whoever's writing and directing films are now not really restrictive anymore. It's not a restrictive medium anymore. You don't need to be in the box. You don't need to follow it. Because that's when the age classification system was born from that. Next slide. So, navigating censorship and freedom of expression in film. So it does, even though we have creative freedom, there is still censorship in different countries as well, and censorship in film raises questions about the freedom of expression and its implications. So basically it brings to light that whether these films will still be, whether films that we make nowadays and the films that were made back then still were controversial in certain ways. So, and still brought raised eyebrows, like in terms of how the filmmaker is using certain elements to tell stories. So, the role of art in society remains a central theme in discussion and censorship. So art itself is very subjective, as a lot of people would say, because it's all about your own interpretation and what you think is art, what you consider art. And cinema, being an art form as a medium of expression, can bring out a positive message, but it can be misinterpreted as a negative thing as well. So you do need to be careful about the audience and who audiences around the world are clearly seeing that content. So historical context. So tensions exist in societal values as enforced by the Hays Codes and artistic intentions. So there is still a historical element to it in terms of the censorship. And the Hays Code does have impact in many ways in the legacy. Even though it no longer exists, it still has an impact in certain ways. Because people do because some people are from certain backgrounds, like religious backgrounds or cultural backgrounds, that won't support certain things. and modern challenges. So modern filmmakers navigate complex regulatory environments in the UK and the US. So it's still a challenge because everyone is seeing your film. All over the world you are going to book exhibits. And people be staying if they see something controversial or something that is deemed abnormal, then they could censor it and ban it and stuff. So the balancing creative freedom with audience expectations and regularity constraints is crucial. So you have to balance. They have to balance it because that's the only way they're going to bring up the fact that just balance it out so it doesn't spark too much controversy and the film will not be censored in certain things. Sometimes they can edit certain things or blur it or all those things. So continuing debate. So there is a debate over censorship and creative expression which continues to this day. So transitioning to modern classification systems. So like the Hays Codes was in decline in the timeline in 1966, and it paved the way for the MPAA to introduce a flexible film rating system, allowing diverse content for various audiences. So basically, it allowed for audiences from many to watch films that based on their age group. An MPAA rating system. So in 1968, they introduced their own rating system, categorizing films such as G, PG, R, and later. But the R became NC-17, basically, offering a clear guidance for viewers. So that's the US version of the classification system. And the nuanced classification, so this classification system allowed for a new nuanced approach, and it informed accommodating a wider range of content that is, while still informing that viewers that there is a suitability based on your age group. As I said before, it protected younger audiences, like children, from potential harm from inappropriate content. And the BBC adaptation in the UK followed this as well, incorporating public feedback and research to maintain relevance in a changing cultural landscape, basically. So the UK followed through in terms of what the US was doing at the time. So there are current trends in film censorship and classification. So the emergence of streaming streaming platforms has changed the regulatory landscape. So streaming services are not as like films released on DVD or on this big screen sort of thing. Yeah, they're not really regulated as much, and the UK regulatory body responses, so it's adapting to new challenges like COVID and the use of streaming services to make high-end film productions and all those things like Netflix, Disney Plus, so It's not as restricted, but they still have the classification system there. But it's just not. It is still there, But to just let you know if that content is really for children or for adults. And the regulatory adaptation in US, it balancing the protecting audiences from certain kinds of content and the creativity element. So you have to balance both, because all you need to do is protect the audience from the harm of that content. So expanded discussions on representation, because there's a lack of diversity within the film industry as well. And inclusion in terms of who's working behind the camera, who's working on front of the camera, and the diverse range of audiences as well. And it does have an impacts on minors in terms of the content that's been produced. And young people can be exposed because they're more or less online. They don't really watch TV that much. So we are in a digital age, but we need to still adhere to this as an audience. And especially protecting the younger generation. So, the evolution of public response to film censorship. Public engagement, so the rise of social media, has significantly changed how audiences engage with films, enabling them to express opinions and scrutinize censorship practices more than ever before. So we have people interacting now. It's like social media has become a platform for expressing thoughts and opinions about certain things. People call it freedom of expression. Freedom of speech, but I say freedom of expression for that sake, because you're allowed to express your thoughts. You can be open. Some people may demonize certain things and all those things, and they may nitpick in how those films or shows impacted the industry itself. So there's censorship. Cultural movements, beg your pardon, I skipped too soon. There are different cultural movements that are trying to become are implementing more inclusive and diverse representation to challenge traditional norms. And they're going against it's reflective of the cultural impact of cinema. So pushing historical boundaries like the Hays Code itself, because having a diverse range of stories and audience characters that you don't really see, or cultures or people from different walks of life that we don't always see. It does go against the Hays Code, because the Hays Code wouldn't have allowed that to happen. So, and nowadays more content is, people are allowed to create what they want to create now. And some people a lot of filmmakers do it based on their own experiences with life and stuff. So the censorship evolution, so that has a broader societal, the evolution of the film classification systems illustrates broader societal changes. So the public demanded more responsive storytelling and the need to reflect contemporary values, so today's values. And the film industry itself becoming more, as it's kind of similar to what cultural movements, so it's trying to push forward for society to become more open and more fought for. More, not in, yeah, inclusive, I would say, yeah. And historical context. So, the Hays Code did restrict the freedom of expression. But nowadays, people were going against at the time. So it challenged what the Hays Code is. And it's not as strong as people thought it was. So a lot of filmmakers challenged it by making content that goes against it. So it allowed the freedom of expression, and people advocated for that. And it has changed the landscape of film censorship for many years to come, really. So the age of social media has, in ways, made everything. Made everything more. You're more or less allowed to be more open and express your thoughts and create things that otherwise won't be created. But you still need to balance protecting and creating others. Content, because like certain broadcasting companies will ban certain, like YouTube, if you're going to upload a short film on YouTube, do you need to make sure that the content is within the guidelines of what YouTube wants. For example, if you're going to upload your film on social media, it does get talked. People do talk about short films, feature films, series on social media, making recommendations. Censorship is no longer something you have to be silent about. But in some countries, they don't have the same thing. They don't have that freedom to express their thoughts and opinions. Like, for example, the industry itself doesn't allow, like, some countries have that because they go by the country's laws, or some countries are like North Korea, they banned lots of things. Basically, you can't be influenced by politics in the West and some politics in the East as well, and all those things, and communism as well. So international perspectives on film censorship. So future directions in film classification. So evolving practices. So film classification and practices will adapt as society changes, because it has actually changed if you think about it in certain ways. What's deemed appropriate and inappropriate, or morally acceptable, or age appropriate, non-age appropriate, all those things. And that's why we have come a long way, but I think there's more to be done. And the ongoing dialogue about representation and inclusivity will change the future guidelines on what the classification would say in terms of the age. So there is a collaborative approach, so involvement of filmmakers and audiences is crucial. So the filmmaker will have more of a say, I think, in terms of, and audiences will both have more of a say on what they deem as appropriate, or what the classification would be for those films. So it's not just left for the people who the board of executives, if you want to say, for the governing bodies of the film classification system. But filmmakers and audiences will have more of a role in terms of that. So the legacy of the Hays Code. So it has profoundly shaped the film industry in many ways, and people going against the grain, challenging the code and the censorship to classification. So the shift from strict censorship to a new, nuanced classification system mirrors societal changes over time. So it made what we thought wasn't appropriate is now becoming a norm, really. Like people kissing each other on the lips because they're in love, or that sort of thing. And the vigilance on censorship. You still need to be vigilant, because that's the most essential thing you need to do, because it does have an impact in many ways, because some audiences may not accept certain stories, and some audiences may have a different view on what they think is more appropriate or what is deemed moral in terms of culture, religion, and all those other things. So morality and creative expression, there is ongoing tension between that, and the Hays Code did brought it to light, really, like, because the film storytelling and production are both quite together, really. Like, it's interconnected, because you are making a film. You wrote that script, and it contains a scene that has shooting in it, like, or violence or sex or some sort of thing, and how you put that into a production does impact what people would say. So it's a good idea to engage in film censorship dialogue. So what do you think of this Hays Code, and how it influenced the film censorship and classification, and how did it affect the way we view films today, and will it become more inclusive, and if we're allowed to express ourselves through cinema? But it respects both freedoms in society now, because more of the content is becoming more diverse, even though we still don't have that into there yet. So I'm just leaving up to you. What do you think? And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and don't worry about these. So subscribe, and I'll see you next. And like and share, and do comment as well. So